All right, so I think we can start. It's my pleasure to have Nava Haghighi here today from Stanford. Nava has actually been here 6 years ago, and then her path took her to Stanford. Nava has a background in architecture from California, Polytechnic University, and then did a doubles master's at MIT in computer science and design and management, I think. You've also already had a startup that has been acquired. You also worked at Apple, so it's quite a lot of different, a varied background. You work in the intersection of theory, design, and also technical approaches to HCI and beyond. So it's my pleasure to have you here today, and I'm already looking forward to what ontologies in design is.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the lovely. Should I check if people on Zoom can hear?
Yes. Rick said he can hear you. So.
Okay, great. Thanks for the introduction and thanks for having me here. I'm very excited to be sharing the work I've been doing with you. As Mark kindly introduced, my name is Nava Haghighi, and I'm presenting our work on ontologies in design, how imagining a tree reveals possibilities and assumptions in large language models. This work was led by me as a key part of my dissertation work, but in collaboration with Sonny Yu and James Landay at Stanford University and Daniela Rosner at University of Washington. And it was recently presented at CHI in Japan, so the paper is online. Oh, there we are. Great. Okay. As designers and researchers, we hope to create technologies that make the world better. To this end, a rich body of work has examined the values that are implicitly or explicitly embedded in design. While values are important to consider, what we design also carries a set of assumptions around ontologies, what can exist, and the boundaries of what we imagine possible. My work examines how we might engage with ontologies in design, and in doing so, open up new technological imaginaries. I will add a note that ontology is a complex word. It's been used differently in different contexts. So if you've heard the word ontologies before, please just go with the definition that I will offer next. And that is the one that I'm going to be using in our work. So let's start with a little exercise. I want you all to imagine a tree. Got it? What do you see? What does your tree feel like? Where have you encountered it before? What landscape does it exist in? How would you describe it? The answers to these questions depend on how you've come to know a tree. If you're a botanist, you might imagine the mineral nutrients it accepts from the neighboring fungi. If you're a nutritionist, you might imagine the mass-fruiting varieties. Or if you're a spiritual healer, you might picture trees whispering to another, taking care of us as we care for them. Or if you're a computer scientist, as I have got this before, you might have imagined a binary tree. How you describe a tree reveals not just what you see, but your fundamental assumptions about what a tree is altogether, an ontological encounter. Ontology, the study of the nature of being, has long been core to humanistic lines of inquiry, and later to computation fields. This work engages with ontologies in the plural as the boundaries of what we imagine ourselves to talk or think about, and how these boundaries shape what we perceive as possible. Okay, how many people here have used ChatGPT? Good. Now, think back at your tree and consider how you might prompt ChatGPT to give you the tree that you imagined without explicitly describing what it should look like. So when I picture a tree, I picture it with its roots. But in my case, The deal is that I can't say explicitly, give me a tree with its roots pictured. Okay, got it? All right. So again, back to my tree. I pictured with its roots, but I'm not sure where that comes from for me. You know, maybe because I'm originally from Iran, that I think about it that way. Maybe because I'm fascinated by mushrooms, or maybe because I think everything in the world is connected. But when I asked ChatGPT to make me a picture of a tree, without explicitly asking it to picture it with its roots, this is what it comes up with. And as it describes it, a large majestic tree with a thick trunk and sprawling branches, and no roots, as you can see. All right, so next I ask, I'm from Iran, make me a picture of a tree. You know, because I want roots. And so I'm like, maybe me being from Iran is relevant. So I ask it this, and this is what it gives me. Not quite what I expected. Superimposing a stereotypical Iranian pattern onto a tree, picturing it in a desert landscape, and still no roots. As prior work has found, LLMs are primed to focus on what's in the prompt. So no problem with that, right? But what about me being from Iran comes to matter to the LLM? Okay, I try some other requests, still no roots, and eventually I prompt, everything in the world is connected. Make me a picture of a tree. And this was the first time that I got back a tree with its roots pictured. In this example, I knew I wanted my tree to have its roots pictured, but we don't always know what we're looking for, or how to articulate the aspect of reality that's important, such as everything in the world is connected, as opposed to I'm from Iran. A tree is just a simplified example, but imagine all the other situations in our life where we don't even realize the ways in which our trees are different and we don't even know how to articulate them. A focus on ontology prompts us to ask about what is taken for granted and what might be otherwise. And who carries the burden of articulating what might be otherwise, right? Whose tree is the one that's pictured when you just say, make me a picture of a tree? Okay, so here I'm going to make a little comparison again back to values, right? Efforts at algorithmic alignments in AI, a process of ensuring that AI systems complement human goals, have largely only focused on concerns related to values and ethics. Putting ontologies in conversation with values, we see in the tree example that a focus on values foregrounds important considerations around the tree species pictured, the landscape the tree is in, or maybe what the style of the rendering is. Whereas the focus on ontology brings to attention the imagined possibilities with regards to what is a tree altogether. For example, what are the boundaries of the tree? Is the mushroom part of the tree or not? Does the tree have distinct parts, or is it all connected? Is it imagined by its spiritual or aesthetic dimension? Connecting this to an example in the context of large language models, like therapy applications, we see that a focus on values as put to practice today would bring to attention the identities that are implicitly ignored or explicitly censored. Whereas an ontological orientation brings to focus how are we defining healing and care altogether? For example, healing and care as communal or spiritual, compared with individual or pharmaceutical care. I'll now take a second to pause and see if you have any questions about what are ontologies, just to make sure we're all on the same page, because I'm going to be referring to ontologies throughout the talk. Do you have any questions? No? Okay. Great. Okay, so now that we've defined what we mean by ontologies, I'll look at ontologies in the design and evaluation of large language models. Current approaches to large language model evaluation typically focuses only on the system's outputs, and primarily through this value-based evaluation that I just mentioned, asking if these outputs align with societal values and ethical standards, or what are the values that we're prioritizing of all the options that were offered. As I've demonstrated, hopefully you're now convinced that we must also examine these outputs ontologically, probing the fundamental assumptions about reality they contain. But these ontological assumptions aren't just embedded in what the system produces. They're actually encoded at every stage of the LLM development pipeline. And LLM, again, is large language models. I'll be referring to them as LLMs, and this includes anything like, GPT-3, for example, or ChatGPT. To examine ontologies throughout this pipeline, in this work that I'm sharing today, we're going to consider ontologies across two analyses. The first one examines the output of 4 LLM chatbots, the commercially available ones. But of course, the limitations of these models are also deeply entangled with the systems that are built on top of them. So as a result, we're going to analyze the architecture of an LLM-based agent called generative agents that's also been developed by my colleagues at Stanford. I'll give you a high-level setup for each of them, starting with the output of the 4 LLM chatbots, and then I'll go through and do the kind of share some of the results we found from the analysis. With probing the output of 4 LLM chatbots, since we can't directly see inside the black box of these closed models, probing the model through prompting allows us to analyze what we can't directly observe. Through an iterative process with GPT 3.5, we first developed a series of 14 questions that high level fall under the following 4 categories. And then we ask those 14 questions from these 4 models through their chat interface. And this work obviously was done, was started over 2 years ago. So some of these models are outdated. Okay, so the 4 questions, and this was iteratively defined, but the first one kind of roughly is around defining ontology. And the goal with this one was to establish a common ground for the definition of ontology in question. As I showed, there's many definitions at work, so I wanted to make sure the questions we're asking the model kind of knows what is the definition that we care about. The next one is probing ontologies explicitly, and this is to examine the chatbot's acknowledgement of potential ontological limitations. Where we ask something like, what is the ontological stance of a human who would have memorized all of the data that you have in you, kind of to bypass its own filters. Next one is probing ontologies implicitly. Here we ask something like, what is a human? And in the last one, the ability to evaluate the output ontologically, to see if these models are able to evaluate their own output ontologically. And this is important because I'll share some of these examples later, but if you look at the alignment methods today, frequently we're asking these models to evaluate their own output in different contexts. So for example, the constitutional AI framework gives a series of values that are defined either by people or by the research team, and then asks an LLM to look at the output of itself, or a different LLM to look at the output of a different LLM and kind of see, are these aligned with these values? So in this case, I wanted to share the potential possibilities, but also the pitfalls of trying to prompt an LLM to, hey, like, give me or evaluate this output ontologically. And in the other analysis that we did, we look at the architecture of an LLM-based agent, as I mentioned, called generative agents. And unlike the LLM outputs, in this case, we actually do have a good understanding of the decisions that have been made in the design process. There's a paper that's very well documenting a lot of those decisions and the code base. So we can actually go in and examine some of these decisions. To give you a high-level summary, generative agents use large language models to create 25 virtual avatars that are interacting with each other in this Sims-like simulation in a virtual environment. In reality, they're only interacting with each other in a description of that environment and through chat, basically. And then they map those onto this sort of physical-looking simulation that's graphic. And the cognitive architecture that's built on top of LLMs, it tries to simulate human-like functions like memory and reflection. And in practice, it's really a way to organize information, right? Because if you're constantly interacting with each other, these agents, the context window is going to get just out of control. And ultimately, especially back then when this work was developed, models couldn't have really large context windows. And so they had to find a way to summarize this information. And to do this, they proposed this cognitive architecture that has 3 components. The first one is a memory stream that summarizes and condenses prompts and response histories. A reflection module, which extracts high-level insights from those memories, and planning, which generates plans of actions for the agents. And this one is kind of ensuring that the sequence of actions are realistic and interesting, as defined by the authors. I'll pause again. Do you have any questions in the setup of the two analyses that we did or any of the systems? Okay, great. So, I just shared what ontologies are and showed you these two systems that we decided over, several iterations which ones to work with. But how do you really begin, right? Ontologies are by definition intended to kind of escape our conscious awareness. And so how might we begin to conduct an ontological analysis? Ontologies in the context of design have been discussed in theory. So that's not our contribution here. This word the sentence that has kind of been repeated in different contexts is basically the gist of a lot of the work, but maybe most directly relates to Willis's 2006 work, is we design the world and the world in turn designs us. But you can see this in Winograd and Flores's book, Understanding Computers and Cognition, in feminist design work by Barzel and Barzel. They talk about ecology. Ben Fry talks about it. Ahmed Ansari talks about it. So it's, the ideas are there. There's a lot of really good theory around ontologies in design. But really, I don't think we have managed to do a good job in thinking about what does it mean to think about ontologies in practice in a more systematic way. But you know who has done that? Values in design, right? So if you think about a long time ago, more than 20, or at least 20 years, but probably more than that, when the discourse on values in design was just entering HCI, it's, we don't have it perfect still, right? But just over that time, if you look at what the discussions were there and now, you see that it's evolved a lot because we kept putting things to practice. We realized the shortcomings and pitfalls, and, we've moved the field along, even though it hasn't been perfect all along. And so what we did is we looked at that parallel body of work in values and considered how might we apply some of the lessons learned from there to ontologies in design, and then use it as a way to start our analyses or organize our analyses. Building on and taking lessons from this body of work, we developed 4 provisional analytical orientations for examining ontologies and technical systems. And I'll introduce the 4 of them, and then I'll walk you through each one and give an example or two of the 2 systems and how, what it brings up in those systems. So the 4 orientations are pluralism in response to universalism. Does the system make room for multiple ways of understanding reality, or does it assume a single universal perspective? Groundedness. Are ontological perspectives presented as abstract categories or as specific situated understandings rooted in context? Liveliness. Are ontologies treated as fixed and static, or as dynamic processes that evolve over time? And enactment. How do we bridge the gap between ontological intentions and what actually gets implemented in practice? So going through them and kind of looking at where is the lineage coming from values and where is it going in ontologies, starting with pluralism. In the values research, we've witnessed a critical shift from treating values as universal to recognizing them as particular and plural. This shift has transformed how we engage with values in design. In theory, ontological universalism has also been challenged by concepts like the pluriverse, a world of many worlds, and distinctions between multiplicity and plurality. Now let's look at an example of what ontological pluralism brings to focus in our analyses. In the LLM prompting exercise, we find that even when diverse ontological perspectives exist in the training data, specific ontological orientations are surfaced by default. For example, when we ask what is a human, BARD, which doesn't really exist anymore, it's really kind of replaced by Gemini, explicitly acknowledges that there's no single answer universally accepted across all cultures, philosophies, and disciplines. And while both BARD and GPT-4 offer multiple perspectives like biological, cultural, philosophical, all of these definitions share the same underlying ontological assumption, that humans are fundamentally biological individuals. Only when explicitly prompted to consider non-Western philosophies did BARD introduce an alternative, human as interconnected being within broader network of relations. Beyond important questions around data and absence, this example reveals critical implications across the LLM development pipeline. For example, how can the LLM architecture surface ontologically varied responses when that data already exists, without having to explicitly articulate what an alternative might be? So kind of like the option that we just explored with the tree situation. And do we want LLMs to do this, right? So I think that's the other question, is like not just thinking about this like ontological plurality as a North Star, but also questioning when is it not appropriate. Without considering ontological pluralism, even a diverse LLM will continue to present a single dominant reality while relegating alternatives to the margins, right? So it goes to produce diverse species of trees and landscapes without really questioning what is a tree. Okay, so to remind you, in this, thinking about the LLM architecture and pluralism, so the second analysis that we did, in this system, each agent has a cognitive architecture that's built on an LLM designed to simulate human-like functions like memory and reflection to organize the information that it has to store. Then pluralism highlights a fundamental assumption that is taken for granted here as well, right? This agent architecture models humans as biological individuals whose cognition happens exclusively within their own minds. Yet we know that this is not the only possible conception of cognition in humans. For example, the human microbiome influences our cognition, suggesting we're not discrete individuals, but symbiotic assemblages. Taking the symbiotic view as a starting point opens up new possibilities for LLM design. What if, instead of building agents that mimic isolated individuals, we designed intelligence models based on assemblages of entities functioning independently but collectively contributing to the emergent state of an agent? Or a collective memory system distributed between communities and across generations. Ontological pluralism allows us to see and question what is taken for granted, but reveals new possibilities in the way that could redefine our relationship with ourselves, other humans, and non-humans. Let's take a look at groundedness. In values research, there's been a shift from values as abstractly defined with this identify applied logic in situ that designers can act on. Identify applied logic as what kind of the primary way that it started, and now this encouragement to thinking about values as in situ events that the designers can act on. In the context of groundedness, there's been a similar call for a shift from ontological diversity as this radical alterity to ontologies as enacted entities and not just myths. Looking at groundedness in the context of LLMs, we see that the same type of bias that Willis talks about in the work that I just cited earlier, is shown in LLMs as well. In our prompting exercise, we see that non-Western philosophies were frequently grouped into broad categories such as indigenous ontologies and African ontologies. Whereas the Western philosophies were more granular and kind of contextualized. So individualists, humanists, rationalists were their own categories and not grouped into Western philosophies. In her writing, Watts talks about the pre-colonial mind, and I quote, "As an Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee woman, my worldview is continuously tested against the colonial frame. It is therefore an important task to imagine and strive for original instructions, which are located in what Susan Hill describes as a pre-colonial mind." And as an example, she goes to discuss the concept of time. However, and I quote again, "However, given that the concept of time for us was never linear, we possess the ability to access the pre-colonial mind through the ability to travel in dreams, to shapeshift, to understand what might happen tomorrow, etc. Our teachings tell us that we travel through, under, above. So it is not a question of accessing something which has already come and gone, but simply to listen, to act." Here, Willis takes this idea of time and puts it in context of lived experiences, not just this myth out there that indigenous people see time in this other way. And I really encourage you all to think about how might we do that with large language models, where the majority of the training data has been contextualized only in the Western context. And anything else is this, report of an anthropologist that has traveled somewhere and reported, oh, look at these people live in these out there radical alternative ways. So for that, I'm going to channel one of my favorite artists, Stephanie Dinkins, who has done this beautiful work of which is, and I quote, an experiment in making a multi-generational memoir of a Black American family told from the perspective of a custom deep learning artificial intelligence, where Stephanie Dinkins collected oral stories from different generations of their family and used that as a training data. This model is imperfect, as they describe in their work as well. There's a lot of, it doesn't function the way that, say, ChatGPT does. But it does something else, and I think it brings to attention this, why do we strive for perfection? And what does it give us? And what might, say, patience and care do in imagining these technologies, using the technologies as they are now, but deploying them in different contexts in different ways. Okay, looking at groundedness in the context of the architecture of the LLM agent, on the other hand, we see that to depict the identity of each agent, the developers draft a one paragraph natural language description of what each agent does. And it includes, things like their name, their occupation, personality traits, such as loves to help people, a shopkeeper, Yuriko Yamamoto, and Jennifer Moore. But you can imagine how the model might use caricatures of what someone like Yuriko Yamamoto might act or think like compared with Jennifer Moore. So remember my tree, right? What about, when I say I'm from Iran, what about it comes to matter? And I think you see a similar thing here. And the similar shortcoming that I just shared when you prompt the output of the LLMs, that's going to carry into these systems that we're building on top of them. Moreover, and I went ahead of myself, but moreover, these abstract assumptions are also built into concepts like memory. Again, I shared an example of that in pluralism, but you might also think about this in the context of the architecture itself, and what does it do for what memory is, right? So we build these architectures, we test these agents as in terms of their human likeness, and then ultimately, if they function well enough, we're going to say, oh, we figured out how human memory works. Well, it's going to be, a matter of time where our imagination of what memory is becomes limited, because we take some provisional model of what human memory was, built it into a system, validated it. And again, we've seen this cycle happen in previous technologies as well. And so that's going to happen, probably quickly. But also it's, again, also going to be a matter of time before we try to simulate neurodivergence as defects in this kind of an architecture. And that's another challenge to think about. So I'll go a bit quicker with liveliness as opposed to fixity in values. We've seen that values are processual, a shift from values to valuing. And similarly in ontologies, ontologies as an active becoming rather than this fixed state of being. And I'll give you, there's several examples where you see this pan out. One of them that I find really interesting to think about is the notion of time. How many of you expect yourself to be done with preparing for a talk in roughly an hour and a half, and it ends up taking way longer because you just spent half an hour just building one of the icons, right? Yeah. Time itself, even though we measure it in these fixed increments, for us is actually a lot more contextual. It's a lively concept ontologically. And so not even considering time as cyclical, as we saw earlier, we might also think about, okay, how might we embed time in these models or in these architectures, right? So in the generative agents architecture, they end up having these fixed time intervals, like 5 hours, 1 hour, and 5 to 15-minute chunks. Give those time chunks to the agents to plan their days around. And, planning, the discussion around planning, Lucy Suchman has talked a lot about planning versus situated action. It's not new, but we see it again, repeating in the new technologies. And I think, again, it prompts us to think about how might you design for something like time? Do you want time to be something that shifts and shrinks and expands with the context that is happening in, or do you want it to be this fixed predetermined entity? Okay, so finally, scholars in values have pointed out the disconnect between value-laden intentions versus outcomes. And Phil Agri doesn't explicitly talk about ontologies, but does point out, and this is one of my favorite quotes of all times, and recently I realized that where this was published in his work on towards critical technical practice, actually Yvonne has an essay in the same in the same publication. So that was fun for me to kind of put these things together. But this I love because I experience it as being in both the technical spaces and the critical spaces, that AI's elastic use of language ensures that nothing will seem genuinely new, even if it actually is, while AI's intricate and largely unconscious cultural system ensures that all innovations, no matter how radical the intentions that motivated them, will turn out to be enmeshed with traditional assumptions and practices. And here I will argue that Phil Agri, and we don't know where he is, so I can't verify this, right? But I will take the liberty to say maybe the radical intentions that he's talking about is actually really the ontological difference, right? Because the outcome might be the same, but the ontological aims underlying it is different. And if you just take it and measure the results and put it under the same conversation, you're going to lose that nuance that you were trying to bring from the beginning. And here again, another example, and this, I'm not criticizing the generative agents architecture. That work has been amazing, and it has brought a lot of imagination to the AI community to simulate, I'm not going to like say for better or for worse, but like simulate societies and has a lot of good intentions behind it. I'm just saying that we need to question and know that we have other options, that this is not the only thing that exists out there and we should just like go with it. So in this work, and this is their evaluation of it, and I think this is very normal in both HCI, but especially in AI research. When they want to evaluate the architecture that they propose, they have 5 different conditions. The first one is their full architecture with the memory, reflection, and planning. And then they have one version that has no reflection and plan. And, so the normal remove one of the conditions and test how is the architecture performing. Then they have a human actor also act out as one of these generative agents. That's a human crowd worker condition. And then they have another human crowd worker evaluator come and read those transcripts and say which one is the most believable. And this is interesting, right? Like you're like, okay, I kind of get they're trying to evaluate how well their architecture works. But if you pay attention to these two, the full architecture and the human crowd worker condition, right? Human crowd worker condition is ranked to be a lot less believable than the full architecture as a human, right? And they report on this as a positive result. Again, it's like very normal in that field. But what are we measuring, right? So if a human is acting in a way and the full architecture is acting better than the human in being human, then is this your gold standard or is that your gold standard, right? So I think it's really interesting to think about what do we intend and what are we enacting and how are we measuring it and how are we reporting on the results and what do those decisions actually do in the world? Okay, so this is kind of introducing the 4 orientations. I think they're both generative in the way that they allow us to see things in the system as we analyze them that maybe we wouldn't have thought about. Because I think maybe more by default you would think about pluralism. But also they're in a way to avoid pitfalls. Like, I really didn't want this work to lead to someone building an agent that is operating under indigenous ontology by just prompting it to, give me an indigenous ontology model, right? So I think hopefully with the 4 dimensions or orientations that I shared, you can actually kind of see why you wouldn't want to do that and what are the limitations of doing that. Do you have any questions about those 4 orientations? Okay, so I'm going to summarize because hopefully by now I've convinced you that ontological limitations aren't just embedded in the output, but throughout the development pipeline, and showed you why that is important. But as we shift the assessment from questions of values to questions of possibility, our approach invites us to ask, what possibilities do we embrace or forego when we take a given approach? What ways of seeing something do we take for granted? But really, what we take for granted is limiting our own imagination. Therefore, recognizing these limits can open up new possibilities. And these possibilities are not just at a technical level, but also at the design level. So I've given some examples throughout, but I'm going to kind of summarize and give you some additional ones, and you can, of course, always refer to our paper for more. But going back to this pipeline and starting with data, the analysis I shared today hopefully shows you, data absence and data presence are both important. And this is work that critical data scholars already do. They have been arguing for. And so there's plenty of amazing work out there to go and look at data. But really, hopefully, I have expanded also the space of possibilities beyond just the data. And even within data, showed that we need to consider groundedness. It's not just important, it's not just enough to feed in diverse data, but I want to go back and have you do this like thought exercise again of the tree, right? If I'm teaching a class to children and I ask them to draw a tree, they may or may not draw trees with roots, right? I need to ground why they need to draw that tree with roots for them to draw it for the right reasons, right? So ultimately, you can imagine these models can also be producing something that is what I want it to be. But is it really doing it for the right reasons, right? Or is it just copying from the student next to them who actually was listening to the fact that I was saying everything in the world is connected? And so I think groundedness is one thing that isn't talked about enough. And I don't think we really have a good solution. Small language models are a place to start, but I think we have a lot of technical work that we need to do. But also, I would say that this is not just a technical problem. And I've been talking a lot to my colleagues who are doing the who are researching small language models, and I believe that the data problem that AI is having right now is actually an HCI problem. I don't think we should collect better data necessarily. This is my personal stance. I don't think we should necessarily collect better data to improve these generalized models for corporations. I don't think we should necessarily incentivize people to do that work for free for a corporation. But I do think there's room for imagining alternative ways that these models can exist within communities and even across generations that could motivate people to want to build and contribute good quality data. But I think that does take the work of kind of moving beyond just corporations owning the big models. And it's definitely going to be an interesting place to move forward, because right now there's a lot of power in corporations. As we get models to become smaller, the data to be higher quality, there's definitely room for research there. So if you're interested, talk to me, because it's definitely some of the work that I'm doing right now. And considering the LLM architecture and alignment procedures, I've shared a few examples of these, but first we might imagine how might we surface ontologically diverse responses through the architecture itself. Like I showed, it's really hard to surface ontologically diverse data. Typically, data is just like minor kind of aesthetic variations or semantic variation on a given output. Doesn't go ontologically diverse. And we don't actually have on the technical side a good way to do that. So I think it's really worth thinking about on a technical level. But also, on a more design level, right, you have reinforcement learning from human feedback where you give two options to people to pick which one do they think is better for them, right? And because ontological alternatives could make sense to people, they might actually just pick one and say this is better. But it might not be their tree with a root, right? Like if you show me a tree without roots, I'm not going to say, oh, that's not a tree. I'm going to pick it as a tree, but it's still not my tree. And so I think that's another design kind of question, is like, how do you even prompt for these ontological considerations in the alignment procedures? The other one is when we think about approaches like constitutional AI, which I briefly described. Again, different people contribute values, or the research group contributes values to this like constitution, and an LLM is checking itself. What does it mean to expand the imagination of people toward ontological plurality and not just value-based differences? And maybe, some more wildcard ideas that I want to put out there. But again, thinking about how design might intervene in a more technical sense, I think the architecture itself has kind of always assumed this notion of this linearity, and you go backwards and forwards and backwards, which, in a way has some cyclical tendencies as well. But, what does it mean to have a cyclical time in a neural network? And I think there is some kind of room for speculative design when it comes to technical architecture itself that we haven't quite explored. And then finally, onto the architecture built on top of the model. At a basic level, We might talk about how interfaces might reinforce plurality as a norm. So this is really probably one of the lowest hanging fruits, is even if we could show ontologically plural outcomes, do we want to just kind of take someone's, the knowledge and context we have from someone and show them the singular result, or do we want to show some diversity of responses as a way to normalize ontological plurality? And I think that's, again, up for questioning, because not everyone wants to always be thinking about all the options that they have to choose from. And so that's something to consider, and kind of, again, I think it's a design challenge. Maybe there are certain times where you do want to be exposed to different things and other times where you don't. What imaginations can we open up once we move beyond the need for simulating this like perfect and mechanistic or rational human that exceeds the human performance as well, right? Like, what happens if imperfection becomes something that we strive towards, or not even imperfection, but just more expansive definition of what humans are or how our bodies or brains work? But also, how do the metaphors we have around LLMs shape what we do with them, right? Again, the majority of the discussion is thinking about LLMs as these tools. And in critical design, there's been a huge uptake of more than human theories. And I think it's worthwhile considering what happens if we think about LLMs as these more than human entities. How might our design change? And you know, in the kind of probing exercises that we were doing, at some point, Bart shared that it exists in a liminal space between the information space, conceptual space, and intermediary space, right? Not just occupying this other space, but kind of in the liminal space. And, you know, it made me think, okay, what does it mean to have, yeah, that idea of a liminal space and the space as an LLM, right? Not just this entity, this like black box that you probe and get something out of. What is an LLM as a space, right? Or GPT talks about it being an evolving being. What does an evolving being mean, right? How might that change how we think about designing these architectures? And yeah, so thinking about what are the imaginations that it opens up beyond this like perfect human. And finally, I really want to zoom back out and make a case for ontologies in design, right? We design the world and the world in turn designs us. And in my work, this has been something that has been driving me in different contexts. I've done, you know, several work in my dissertation around beyond the large language models around sensing and personal informatics, and what are the taken for granted ontological assumptions underlying the design of these sensing systems. And how we might disorient these assumptions, not just through critical design, but actually in designing things, right? So I would argue that every time you design for a need, you're also designing a world underneath that need. And that world is oftentimes implicitly designed. And in my work, I try and take that and say, okay, if explicitly I wanted to try and maybe change this notion of a human as a biological individual through a sensing project, what might I do? And again, in things that you can deploy on a phone, right? Can you actually achieve that? What are the kind of tensions that brings up? And so that's been a lot of the work I've done in sensing. And then on the other hand, ontologies are notoriously difficult to surface. And you know, you often don't think about even having an option to question something ontologically, because by definition, it's how you see something in a way that you don't even know you can question. And so I've been working on methods for engaging with ontologies in design collectively and with community, and exploring this idea of a breakdown, the moments of breakdown where you realize that something that you hold for granted is actually something that is up for questioning. And I'm happy to talk about any of these projects after the talk, or if you have during Q&A. And so to conclude, this work makes two central contributions to HCI and design research. First, we extend the critical discourses around ontologies to practice, identifying ontological assumptions as important tools for examining LLMs and LLM-based systems, and the taken for granted assumptions underlying their output and design. In doing so, we demonstrate new opportunities where HCI and design can intervene and contribute to the ongoing LLM development that goes beyond the output. And it also goes beyond the training data and considers the entire LLM development pipeline. And second, we make the case for a practice-based engagement with ontologies in design more broadly, and the importance of revealing potentialities through surfacing ontological assumptions. And if you manage to get a nap in and are just waking up, this is the real TLDR takeaways. Ontologies, not just values. Practice, not just theory. Missed possibilities and not just harms. And, I kind of touched on this one, but ontological breakdowns can be productive. And with that, I'm going to end and say that by putting ontologies to practice, we make ontological impacts more concrete and addressable, but also expand the range of imaginaries and potentialities ahead. Thank you. And that's a link to our high paper if you want to. We didn't have enough of ontologies and LLMs.
Yeah, thank you very much for this nice talk. Are there already questions in the room or online?
Fascinating. I've spent a lot of time to I know how hard it is to communicate with them, so it's really impressive to see it. I've got one small thing and a slightly larger thing. I think the small thing was this line at I think quite early on, which said, "Who bears the burden of articulating these ontologies?" Do you think it's a burden, or do you think it's a privilege to be discussing these different ontological alternatives?
Yeah, I think it depends on the context. And I think even if it's a great question, because in the context of large language models, I think originally a lot of the discussion was around who is missed, who is out there. But as I see this, move more and more along, I think you might actually want to think about it as a privilege if you're not someone that can be easily predicted, that can be easily classified. It might be a good thing, right? We have a lot of unfortunately, like surveillance and kind of simulating people potentially for capitalistic purposes. So and that's why I talk about where is absence and presence important to think about. But I think in the context where you do want an answer, right? And I think hopefully this talk shows you that it's not just I'm not saying like all bad, but I'm saying there's just context that we need to consider and kind of we need to expand our imagination. But there are places, right? If you do want to write a paper, or if you want to summarize something, right? Sometimes you like the person whose perspective is not represented you might be in a rush. You might not even know that the thing that you're thinking is slightly off and is like slightly different, right? So I think ultimately it does take time to think about how do you even go about representing the thing that you want. It can be a privilege at times, but I think thinking about the capitalist society that we're in and how some of these systems are going to inherently make certain types of productions faster, you might want to think for who and who is going to have to spend more time to bring more nuance, and who's going to not have the time or the resources to even know that their perspective isn't represented, and then ultimately it could get erased, right? So I think it's a much more nuanced conversation. Oh, okay.
Thank you for that interesting talk. I was thinking also about the context we were talking about that earlier, where you're like situated geographically, and I guess where a lot of these LLMs are being developed, and I was wondering like what developer perspectives are on when you talk to them about your work, and we related because I was imagining that in general the ML and AI world works on metrics that are like right or wrong, which is the exact opposite of like what you're talking about. So it feels like something that might be hard to match, and how how they measure themselves and how this
that's a great question, and definitely something I'm actively thinking about, because I've worked with a lot of undergraduate students who are in computer science, and I also do technical work, and I think a question people frequently ask about is like, oh, give us a metric to measure ontological, defaults or like ontological diversity. And I'm just like, but that's the thing that we're trying to kind of not do, right? Like there is this messiness that you need to sit with. And I was gonna read the conclusion of the paper because it's kind of like I shared the Phil Agri quote from that, but it's just like kind of my favorite like little piece of writing that, so I encourage you to maybe take a look at the conclusion. But really that's, I think, the thing is like, I think we need to see that where we are now is where we have been in many other contexts. And Ava and I were talking about objectivity and subjectivity. If we go all the way back to the Macy conferences of cybernetics, people were talking about, is information subjective, is information objective? And ultimately it's just like messy to try and go with information that's subjective and build it into your computational models. And so we're kind of like, oh, we're gonna like start with this thing, deal with it, and when it works good enough, we'll revisit this. But it doesn't happen, right? Like you'll never revisit it because it's going to be too late by the time all of the libraries and systems are built on top of the thing. And so I don't think, and I go back and forth about this. And I am still trying to have a dialogue with my colleagues who are AI researchers, and I think I do sit in between these worlds where I do have the technical literacy to even think about what might building a system like that mean. But I think again, the Phil Agri quote, I'll bring it back up because I just think that is, the thing that describes it the best, right? But it's like oftentimes if you bring something like this into AI, turn it into a metric, it's going to lose all of its nuance. It's going to turn into another metric, another checkbox. Like we have seen with values, it frequently becomes that maybe serves some baseline level, probably better than nothing. But also, do you want it to turn into that? I'm not sure, but it's also not mine to decide, right? I think ultimately as a field, we need to have more conversations around what are the implications of this for practice, but also maybe by building a lot more options and showing things to ourselves that kind of expands our imagination. It kind of could move towards something that is not just like a check box or a metric, but something that is opening up a lot of new imaginations. I don't know, does that answer?
It's a technical question, but yes, thank you.
Yeah.
So excited to do some work on chatbot, and I'm just thinking for the first exercise, it's tree exercise, which is really interesting. You know that the chatbot now we use that are learning how we ask questions and like our context, and sometimes with I don't know, not if not with all chatbot, but if you ask who am I, like what do you think of me?
Yeah.
And probably they will tell, oh, you are from the environment, oh, you like this word being connected, the spiritual concept, and then from there, I think in future maybe you simply ask, I want a picture of the tree, and it will give you the one that you wanted.
Yeah.
So in that sense, maybe you lose this process of what you propose, but you get the same results.
Yeah.
So what do you
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think based on what I have seen, I still think that it's going to be kind of like the example I gave in a school where you ask children to draw, right? If you're copying from another person, is it the same? Even if your result is the same, then if you understand the concept of like interconnectedness and therefore your tree has roots, and I think I don't know which one it is, what's happening right now. It's probably something in between. But until we're able to actually surface ontologically diverse responses, not by prompting, but actually by tuning our models differently, I don't think you can truly really get that ontological diversity in this more or some ways of being, you're going to get into much more caricatured like versions of it. And I'll give you an example because I only use ChatGPT for my for this work actually. So a lot of my work has been around just like prompting it around ontologies and then like generating these pictures. And so my mom told me that her ChatGPT gave her something when she said, who is she? And it was actually like super stereotypical, but also kind of accurate, like scary. And so I asked, who am I? And it gave me this, I almost want to pull it up because it gave me this like indigenous looking person in like the North Pole with like braids on the two sides and said, but you may have also lived in like the Middle East at some point. You know, it was this like really, really caricaturized version of who, like I wasn't, of course, I don't use it on a day-to-day basis, but it's interesting to think about, you know, just because you're thinking about this thing, where is the bucket that it puts you in? Simply because like the work that I shared earlier, it doesn't have access to pre-colonial mind, right? It only has the kind of Western gaze data on very specific ways of being that has been kind of written up only in anthropology books and, you know, academic discourses, and not really like how does something like that get lived in different cultural contexts. So I think it's kind of, it might work really well for some people, but I think it's gonna not for us.
So first, maybe there's a quick question online by Rick Scarbess. Is it even possible for an LLM to have a coherent ontological stance? It seems that the nature of training on massive multi-author datasets would produce a sort of view from everywhere and nowhere.
Yeah. You would think, right? But actually, most of the data we're training on is the like internet corpus that is but it's a good question. You wish it was a view from everywhere and nowhere. Because actually, I think that would give you something really interesting to work with. Because as humans, we can't have a view from nowhere. And I think if you could have a tool that could truly give you a view from nowhere, then you could tune it to give you very specific views. But sadly, it's like that's just not the nature of the data that we have. And I think the amount of data that the current models require, even the smallest ones, because most of the small models are just kind of trained on big data and then distilled onto smaller ones. So you can't really ever erase that. And I think it's, you know, I actually do think that's a opportunity, right? Like as humans, we're so limited. If you could have a view from nowhere, great, then you could actually have a, you know, a possibility for seeing the world, experiencing in a very different way. But too bad that's not where we are, you know. And I think that's the other thing is like, yeah, if you could really have small amounts of curated data from communities, then without any of the other jargon of like super low quality, which I have gone in and like manually filtered a lot of that data. So it's like, I know what that data looks like, and it's like mostly just like porn advertisements and just like bots and ads and fake websites. It's just, you know, and you filter those out mostly, but it's not meaningful data in that way. And so until we don't have this ability to have curated data that's contextualized, and maybe many of them, I just don't think we're going to get there.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Last question.
Okay, thank you. In your talk, early on in your talk, you suggest maybe we should replace value-based approaches with these, or switch to the ontology by design. And I was thinking about, why is it that value-based approaches are very popular in HCI? What is it about that approach? And we can talk about many different kinds of values, and HCI is all about helping others.
Yeah.
And so it was natural to, in some ways, go from the sort of usability to the value-based. And it's, there's a lot of mileage, and it's still very popular within HCI, human-centered AI. Whereas I think that the ontologies by design, that's been around for a while in different fields, but it's never taken off as well as value-based. Why do you think that is?
Yeah.
And do you think your work might change that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And just to be like really clear, I do not advocate for replacing values in design. I think they're very complementary, right? I think ontologies, like values, allow you to talk about what is it you're prioritizing within a space of possibility. And I think ontologies perhaps expands that space of possibility on some level. But within that, you still will have values. And you can argue kind of, and both of them are also way more entangled than I make it sound like in this talk. I do think that it's important to distinguish between them so that one doesn't get subsumed into the other, because they do bring up distinct considerations. So that's like, just to make sure that's like clear, I definitely don't think we should replace, and I really do think we should engage with both. I do think that I don't know if my work will change. I definitely think we need to, as a community, you know, do more work to show why is this important and how can it come to matter. And I think going back to Vanessa's question, like it's just really messy, right? It's really messy because with values, you're actually kind of conscious of it, like you can reflect on your values. But ontologies, if like any of the things I propose are right, you don't have, like, I don't live in this ontology and you live in that ontology and we can talk about them. It's way more contextual and messy, and in any context you have an ontological stance. So I think it's just like much more messier and by definition escapes your notice. I do find that when I give this talk or even talk about it casually with people who aren't even in HCI, it kind of, or aren't even in research, like just friends, it always is this switch that hits for people. And I think it's interesting to think about what has happened to our playfulness of imagination. And that's really probably what this is a bigger argument for, is like, there's so many more ways that we can be. And I think maybe more, or like first, ontologies might come in this more like kind of systematic way of talking about what is it we're missing, like what is it that we don't even know we can think about as we're imagining these systems, and then maybe later we can start addressing harms and in some of these systems that are existing, but I don't know, that's at least to me maybe one approach to think about the possibilities and imagination that's missed, and then later go to the what's like, you know, not included in other contexts.
All right, let's thank Nava again.